All right, good. And now we can just start the discussion. This piece from 1965 originally, it was a talk he gave in 1965 that he published right away in 1966, and it is well known for being the first article in what will become the exchange between Habermas and Gadamer. This is the piece that Habermas is first responding to. That's part of the Habermas Gadamer debate, and it's a like John said, it's a great philosophical piece, right, John? It hits on so many themes in Truth and Method in just a short space that if you had to pick maybe one or two articles just to really get some of the main ideas of Gadamer, this would have to be high in the list of those you might choose. So I wanted to ask either people who are new to Gadamer, new to the group, or people who have been reading Gadamer for decades or their whole life, it feels like. What would you like to start with? Is there something in here that you really think, oh, this is where we ought to begin, or something that you were so moved, inspired, disturbed by that it would be hard for you to sit and wait if we didn't talk about that? Yes, Eddie, what do you have?
Um, the thesis statement of this essay in my mind.
Yeah.
Um, our task, it's the bottom of page 3.
Okay.
Our task, with my edition,
With
if
your addition. Okay.
yes, the philosophical hermeneutics by David Lynch, translated by
Sure.
David Lynch. Our task is to reconnect the objective world of technology, which the sciences place at our disposal and discretion, with those fundamental orders of our being that are neither arbitrary nor manipulable by us, but rather simply demand our respect. And I think if that's the thesis statement, the whole point of this paper then is to figure out, well, then what is this what are these fundamental orders that simply demand our respect? And I think
Nice.
that's the trajectory of the whole paper.
That's the linchpin that everything sort of follows from there. In the Gadamer reading, Gadamer reader version is page 78. It's really it's the last sentence of the first paragraph.
Mm,
The translation is the same. It's the same
mm,
translation as in philosophical hermeneutics. And at the start, it's about the objective world of technology, which the sciences place at our disposal and discretion, with the fundamental orders of our being that are neither arbitrary nor manipulable by us, but demand our respect. And what would you say those orders are?
My first sense is it's it's what Gadamer would call as the supra-individual
Hmm.
norms, values, tradition, history
Language?
that are, beg pardon?
Language?
Yeah, language.
Okay.
These things that are both above, beyond us, beyond individuals, but at the same time are things we adhere to.
Right. And the
Mm.
things that we belong to
Yes, we belong to.
and shape us,
Mm.
but also things that to take a purely objective scientific approach to
Mm.
will distort the way they
Yes.
function in our lives, something like that,
Well,
right? That's
yes, will defeat the purpose um of establishing these orders.
yeah. Okay.
Mm.
Yeah, Eric.
Yeah, running with that, I was looking at 82 in the reader. I'm not sure what page it is in the other one, but the paragraph where he's talking about prejudices constitute our being more than right our intentional thoughts. So Eddie, related to what you were saying, these things that we can't really, what was the quotation that you
We
just
can really manipulate and
right?
try to take control of.
Right. It's hard to control and manipulate these things that aren't
Yes.
arbitrary, but they're also not easily intentional. And
Mm.
the example that I was thinking of is how, right, there's this kind of global hegemony of using the Gregorian calendar. Like, what year is it? Because
Mm.
2026 is like the
Yes.
obvious answer. And
Mm.
it's not really easy to get people to use the Islamic calendar or the Jewish calendar or the Buddhist calendar, right? Like,
Mm.
it's very difficult. So there's like this authority of 2026 that's really hard to like control, manipulate, all that. As
Mm.
an, is that an example of what might fit with what you're saying, Eddie?
Ah. I'm not sure. I may need a help on this, but I do think um, if we're talking about something like a hegemonic, as to borrow the word, a hegemonic um, sort of establishment that sort of enframes, sorry for the Heidegger word, puts everybody in under one set of framework, then I think there is something in that which Gadamer wants to tell us that perhaps we are only interacting, engaging, participating within these framework. We do not try to seize control of them, and by seizing control of them, seize control of other people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. I would think one disanalogy would be that you could imagine changing calendars. I mean, this is actually something they tried to do during the French Revolution, right? Is to put into place a whole new system of based on tens. It didn't work, but you couldn't imagine doing that same sort of thing with a language. It's not simply a matter we're all going to decide to just take up a new language. There's ways in which we're embedded in languages, or calendars feel more arbitrary than say language or traditions does to me. But they do have something that I see what you're saying, Eric, that we sort of belong to, and that's hard to just sort of do something otherwise. Michael, do you want to get in here?
Uh, yeah, I was thinking that the calendar seemed like kind of at least the especially Gregorian calendar seemed almost like this middle ground between like it is one of those I guess like a calendar is a technology to for recording time, but at the same time, especially like and now around the world, but especially in the West, like it became like a tradition where now we're getting into those things that go beyond us because we're like it seems like part of those fundamental orders being like just tradition like the technology and the tradition kind of come together, but then I think you get even to a more fundamental order where what's the calendar for? The calendar was for keeping track of seasons, and that's why when the Julian calendar started going out of date, they had to actually skip what 10 days to kind of get things readjusted because it seemed like the seasons were the thing something about those things that were a fundamental order that were not manipulable. You couldn't I mean nowadays we do have like greenhouses and stuff like that, but even then like the I feel like they're the exceptions that prove the rule because of how much energy needs to be put in to manipulating when something grows. It just shows you that like it's not maintainable large scale. Like we have to eventually kind of pay our dues to the fundamental order of the seasons. You can see it even like seasonal affective disorder type things where we're affected by the seasons. And so like it seems like you get this like scale actually thinking about calendars between like the things that are so fundamental in our experience to the things that are technology and then like all those things in the middle.
Right. Okay. I see that. There's still a basic fundamental reality here that are going to make some calendars work better than others, and it's constantly pulling us toward technology and things like seasons. Right.
Yeah.
Michael Raskin.
Yeah, I like Eddie pointing that out as the thesis. I also took it as that, and I took the the orders that he's talking about as the three types of consciousness that he mentions.
Nice.
That's the aesthetic, the historical, and the hermeneutical. I don't know if that's a good correlation, but that's what I thought he was referencing.
Yeah, that would make sense.
And
I think
there's
we should talk about each of those. I think.
Yeah, there's and it made me think that too, because on page 8 at the end of that first paragraph, he mentions those three, and the first word he uses is our task. So that's
Mhm.
what made me think that. He says, our task, it seems to me, is to transcend the prejudices that underlie the aesthetic consciousness, the historical consciousness, and the hermeneutical consciousness that has been restricted to a technique for avoiding misunderstanding and overcome the alienations present in them all. So that's what I was like. That's how I made that correlation between those two.
So aesthetic, historical, and hermeneutic.
Yeah, those are the orders of being that can't be manipulated by us, but we kind of have to grant
Hmm.
them being, basically.
Right. Yeah. Okay, good. That makes sense. John Beach.
Yeah, uh, Eddie Lee just sort of blew my mind there because, yeah, absolutely. Right, running through it. That's the theme on almost every paragraph in this entire piece. And we haven't spoken on it ahead of time.
No.
But like I made two lists: hermeneutic universality on the one side, and modern science on the other side. And you really can't understand this without reading Heidegger and Aristotle, I don't think, very deeply. But nevertheless, this is why I say it's a philosophical as opposed to, sort of an explanatory, how to read a text type of thing. But, you've got on the one side, you've got, free teleology that's in speech and language and thought. On the other side, you have the calculation, mathematics, and nonverbal science, and the one side you've got the primacy of being, and the other side, it's Descartes onwards. It's primacy of the subject and self consciousness, and then on the hermeneutic side, you've got things itself by itself, which would be Aristotle, which is physis, and then on the modern side, you have conformity of space and time to law, which is the way Kant defines nature after Newton, and all things in space and time. And on the hermeneutic world, the Greek world, you have truth and facts, and on the modern side, you have the unshakable objectivity. And by the way, Heidegger says there were no objects before Descartes. There were no such things as objects in the modern sense. And, you got Plato, Aristotle versus Descartes, Galileo. Beginning Greece, beginning with Descartes, because the fundamentum inconcussum is Heidegger saying this is a beginning. This is a totally new beginning with Descartes. That the tradition is cut off. And so on. Like I can go on with another 10, 12 things. Like the I, thou, for example, recognition of the deep common understanding that already exists, the we, and the modern is the I and the thou. You have the ego and the thou, which already Gadamer says show a real sort of difference, an unbridgeable difference right there, and so on. I mean, I'll stop there, but I can go on and on in this. But this is the you really have to see what Heidegger's saying about technology, I think, and that helps. And also, I'd say with the three things when Gadamer mentions the hermeneutics, he's talking, I think, about like the problem, like the alienation with Schleiermacher's hermeneutics, and not with his hermeneutics. And I think that's the third form of like both aesthetic consciousness, historical consciousness can be forms of alienation, and the hermeneutic consciousness before Gadamer came along. So I'll just shut up. I'll just say that much.
Thanks, John. That's a lot. I hope one thing in the next hour and 45 minutes, 40 minutes that we get clarified is when you have these two different category columns of universality, are they both the same kind of universality? Does science actually have the universality that it claims to have, for example? Maybe it's not true universality, is hermeneutic. So exactly what is the relation between the kind of universality of those two categories? I'd love to find a way to get straight on in the next hour and a half. So that's
excellent question.
Joseph.
Hey, I'm just going to kind of add to the plate of questions. And this goes along with what John was saying at the end. He's like, what exactly is the nature of alienation that Gadamer is talking about? He's talking about in the aesthetic consciousness, the historical, and the hermeneutical. But sometimes it's kind of vague to me, like what's
what is how are we alienated, and how do we overcome this alienation? Um, there also seems to be this is probably the third time I've read this, and it's always kind of funny to me that very quickly Gadamer poses the question, "What is hermeneutics?" and then just jumps right into talking about alienation. And as far as I can see, doesn't actually directly return to the question again.
Mhm.
And I'm curious to like, how does hermeneutics relate to alienation? Is he positing it as some way of overcoming alienation? And what does that look like? Those are lingering questions of mine.
All right, great. Thanks, Joseph. Alienation. Eric.
So I wanted to riff off of something Max was getting at earlier when we were still talking about the calendar and seasons and nature, but also to add to the list, just so David, you have the list. I want to talk about our political situation. It's on page 80 of the reader. Um, Also, what are some examples of misunderstanding from page 81? Um, and I want to ask about the difference between the fitting word and the magic words
Yeah.
on page 87. And then the lovers parroting slogans like AI versus speaking toward the end, the last paragraph on page 88. So that's just a list of, but to get back to this thing that Max was talking about, on page 85 in the reader, the paragraph is right before he says, as a student of Plato, I particularly love those scenes where Socrates is in dispute with Sophus. So it's the paragraph right before that. And he's still talking about this kind of control that we can have. I'm sorry, the waste of like research questions that he's talking about.
It's on page 85. He's talking about sort of the methodological spirit, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he gets into this thing that I'm wondering if a way to talk about the control that starts to happen in the human sciences or the humanities is kind of parallel to engineering, where we can domesticate wolves into dogs, right? And we can domesticate the humanities into like, what are some of the research questions he brought up? He's like, who would ever ask, about the taxation practices of 15th century cities, right? That there's this kind of engineering of knowledge production rather than the alternative. And this gets to Max, what you were bringing up with nature. Like, what is the alternative? This kind of natural spontaneity, where he brings up the word accident, like these accidental insights. And so I'm thinking about like natural selection and mutations, like accidental mutations versus cultivating certain kinds of animals, right? Like, how do we allow the humanities to like evolve through the accidental mutations rather than engineering it into a specific kind of thing? That's so like Max getting at this, kind of bringing up nature, like what is the natural evolution of that rather than the engineered kind.
Okay. I think I understand it. At the heart of this section is where he's talking about it's almost a version of the fusion of horizons. He's saying when you engage something historically in a non-alienating way, it should speak to us today. It should have something to say to us. It should enlighten us. It should move us and inspire us and lead us to think differently, not just about the past. Right? He says, and so he's considering an objection. Well, don't some people do all sorts of obscure things? I got to write a dissertation on something, so I'm going to pick something no one else has written on. And he wants to say that, well, hopefully they're not just cranking things out just to get done with no excitement or interest or sense of wonder or appreciation or feeling like there's something really interesting here. I think he thinks that always has to happen for us to understand at all. We don't understand at all unless we understand how it's speaking to us and relating to us. I could see how that could happen accidentally. You could just start exploring. You could say, I wonder what's here, and just start reading and then allow yourself to be excited, as opposed to a kind of engineered, manufactured research project. I'm picturing somebody with like a humanities lab. Oh, I'm working with this scholar, and they've got a set of projects, and just here you go, you can pick one. And I've worked this all out, and you can apply my method to various figures. I've got a method now. Who would you like to apply this to? And which may or may not produce any insight. It's not even part of the game, right? This is sort of what you're talking about. Is that fair, Eric? So okay, all right, Max, go ahead. You've been waiting. Thanks. I just want to be clear about Eric's point.
No worries. I think when I was just adding, when we're adding to questions, like the one, and I think this is one of those things where I feel like it's almost one of those things that gets talked about, a lot of this has been talked about like, I mean, Gadamer's aesthetics and all that, but I guess part of me is like always, he mentions, I think in like on like 79 about a genuine artistic creation, but at the beginning he mentions like the world of technology, and I'm just thinking like there's like techne, which is, I know like art, like it brings in something different when we talk about art today, but just kind of, I don't know if there's a question there so much, but part of me is like, I feel like sitting with like that bridge between like what we call technology and art. There's something more there that I feel like sometimes gets, I don't know, uh, lost in the the distinctions that, I mean, that are good distinctions, but like there's some little bit that I think is there, and maybe I'm just kind of saying, I just want to point that out and feel like if we see anything strange happening with the way that art is dealt with and the way that technology is dealt with and how that comes together, because they're not fully separate things in our lives. That's just like a thing maybe to sit with and look out for,
Yeah,
if anything comes up.
to flag and sort of be
Yeah.
sensitive to that. Yeah, I like that. Yes, Ty.
Yeah, I think I like what you said there, Max, and I think what Nathan just put in the chat too kind of connects to what we were talking about and Joseph's question about alienations. To me, it struck me that one of the ways that Gadamer is trying to sort of push us forward is to pointing out those alienations and showing how instead of like the sort of scientific consciousness or something, hermeneutical consciousness is trying to sit with those alienations so that those questions arise, so that we can find those, happy accidents. And that's like the role of the imagination there, is to be able to sit there and find those connections and allow, and that's sort of, it seems to me like his way of overcoming those alienations, even though that probably leads us to more alienations.
Yeah, I think we should probably dive into the alienation part, right? It's in the beginning now. Questions are coming up. Eddie, is your comment about alienation?
Yes, right about it.
Go for it.
So, um, to that point, I think the place we want to go to is page 79, in the document.
Okay.
Well, to the extent when we judge a work of art on the basis of its aesthetic quality, something that is really much more intimately familiar to us is alienated. This alienation is aesthetic judgment. In the aesthetic judgment, always takes place when we have withdrawn ourselves and are no longer open to the immediate claim of that which grasps us. This one point of departure from truth method was that the aesthetic sovereignty that claims its right in the experience of art represents an alienation when compared to the authentic experience that confronts us in the actual encounter with the artwork. So I think we've just, if we were to connect that with our discussion on Truth and Method, part one, the talk on content aesthetics, one of the criticisms I take is that if you were to claim that kind of aesthetic consciousness, what you're actually doing is that you're really just ending up experiencing how you yourself experience the art. So you sort of get into a redundant circle where you just repeatedly explore yourself. That doesn't work, or that is not the only sort of experience we have when we encounter these aesthetic objects. So Gadamer says instead, well, what we should see is the authentic experience that confronts us in the actual encounter with the artwork. And and encountering for me always means something like being open to interacting with the artwork so that there is a play in between ourselves and our counterparts. The interaction with world is what I take to be the most important aspect that leads us out from the alienation. The alienation that supposes there's something um, stands beyond um, our engagement with objects, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's look right at that what you read and maybe much of that paragraph. The paragraph begins, "What is hermeneutics?" And your point will be that alienation is not an essential feature of our relations to works of art. It arises when we take up a certain sort of aesthetic attitude toward a work of art and only engage it in aesthetic terms,
Yes, we
rather
miss.
than allowing it to engage us or speak to us.
Mm,
Is that fair?
yes, doing that misses many other things that the aesthetic encounter could offer us.
Yeah. Good. Let's see what he says. I want to look at the long paragraph. Let's pick I mean, we can do the whole thing. The aesthetic consciousness. This is now 3 or 4 lines into the long paragraph. He's going to start by talking about the experience of alienation of aesthetic consciousness. And the aesthetic consciousness realizes a possibility that as such we can neither deny nor diminish in its value, namely that we relate ourselves either negatively or affirmatively to the quality of an artistic form. So it's because this I think he's talking about non-alienated. Does that sound right? Relating to it, whether it's negatively or affirmatively, because we cannot deny nor diminish the value of this experience, right? We're in relation to it. This statement means we are related in such a way that the judgment we make decides in the end. No, so, this makes me think he's talking about alienated consciousness. The statement makes we are related in such a way that the judgment we make decides in the end regarding the expressive power and validity of what we judge. That sounds like he's saying we take up the work, we decide whether it's good or not, we render a judgment. Maybe we can decide certain things about it are good, other things are not, and that's the end of it. Yeah, because then he says what we reject has nothing to say to us, or we reject it because there's nothing to say to us. This characterizes our relation to art in the broadest sense of the word, a sense that, as Hegel has shown, includes the entire religious world of ancient Greeks, whose religion of beauty experienced the divine in concrete works of art that man creates in response to the gods. Now I'm confused again. Are we talking about the alienated experience, or are we talking about the non-alienated experience? This sounds like the non-alienated experience, whose sense is
What we're
religious
alienated
experience.
from. What we're alienated
That's
from.
what we're alienated from. Okay. Is that sort of where the religion of beauty experienced the divine in concrete works of art that man creates in response to the gods?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it seems like if we're to read it, grammatically correctly, we should actually break the paragraph from ethics judgment and then start a new paragraph at the same time, however. Because that's when he now talks about, starting from the at the same time, however, that's when he talks about what it's like to not be alienated, but then to engage with the artwork.
Right.
Yeah, the however is the transitional phrase, right? So
Okay.
I think the translation didn't do a good job in separating the paragraphs.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah.
So it sounds like he thinks that the alienation of aesthetic consciousness is something that occurred historically at a certain point in history. Maybe this connects to what John Beach was saying about Descartes as being an important turning point. Right? The idea that there was a time where this was not an issue, where we never treated works of art simply in terms of aesthetic terms and aesthetic judgments. We always recognized them as having something to say to us about something profound, maybe something religious. We must admit that the world of artistic tradition is more than a mere object of our free acceptance or rejection. It is not true that when a work of art has seized us, it no longer leaves us the freedom to push it away from us once again and to accept or reject it. Is it not true? I see. It no longer leaves us the freedom to push away once again and accept or reject it on our own terms. So that is when a work of art seizes us, we realize there's something new happening here that we have to take seriously, that we can't just simply default to our way, the ways we have been thinking about art in order to accept it or push it away. Joseph, you want to get in here and help out? You brought up alienation.
Yeah, maybe I'll take a go at it. Is the picture simply this, that when I relate to a work of art as a mere object of the aesthetic,
Mm-hmm.
then I foreclose the possibility that it says something to me. So if I listen to Taylor Swift and I say, I don't like this music, and I judge it in aesthetic terms alone, I foreclose the possibility that her music can speak to me, seize me, say something, and that's what alienation is for the aesthetic consciousness. Is that all he's kind of saying?
I think that is what he's saying, and I think he's saying that our culture has moved toward making this the primary way of relating to works of art. As we see a work of art and we say, well, do I like it or do I not like it? What's good about it? What isn't good about it? Rather than allowing for the possibility that it has something to connect to us or teach us.
I think I might have
Yes, Max?
I'm thinking back to I did a master's thesis on like Aquinas and art and looking back at like older versions of art, and I feel like there's something here having to do with that.
Yeah.
Not directly, but like it seems like Gadamer's talking about not only those times when we're alienated because we can judge, but it's almost like because that's our primary way of, I guess, relating to things, that like we're already kind of a step away and like things could still grip us, but like it's almost like we have to do the judgment first. Whereas like what I'm thinking about, and I don't know if this is exactly what Gadamer's thinking about, but one of the disagreements I had with looking at various views of like medieval ideas of art was that the distinction between like what we call like the I guess usually consider art and other arts weren't what like was so blurred. It's not like it wasn't there. And it goes into what Gadamer talks about, those like occasional arts, and like, you know, when he talks about like architecture and things like that that are kind of a part of our life and have useful parts. Like there was always a place within life, like churches and things like that. And I think that when you're in that either religious or even just state things, whatever cultural things, you don't get to judge it before it's there. And like it's always there as a part of your life, and it's already valued. Whereas with the aesthetic thing, you have the value beforehand, and I think it goes back to that earlier idea, which I mean, you know, I like Heidegger and Hegel, like they're all like talking about, but where, but I think in some ways, I think one of the breaking points like is Kant and the way he deals with art, whereas I guess you might have to go a little beforehand, but like there was a certain continuity of all the arts that you didn't separate it, and I guess I see that coming out here in some
Yeah,
way.
that makes sense. I think with Kant, you get a real distinction between the form and the content of the work of art. So that Kant will say, well, anything can be made beautiful, right? We really aren't judging the content of the work when we're judging it aesthetically. And it seems like that starts to move away, especially, and most obviously, it's problematic in the case of religious art. I guess an example that came to mind was a few years back, the Met in New York acquired a 14th century Madonna painting, and it's still the original frame, and there were burn marks from candles because it was a devotional painting. And then they had crowd problems because so many people were praying the rosary to it that they had this clog of people. And it's like, that's not where you're supposed to in a museum. In a museum, you stand back and you take it in and you appreciate the brushstrokes, or the way maybe you don't see any brushstrokes. Right? They were not treating it aesthetically, they were treating it as a sacred religious object. And I think that's the way in which, I think Gadamer uses religious works of art throughout here as an example of a kind of authentic, non-alienated experience that you would expect to have. That would be weird if you're in front of an altarpiece and you started critiquing the formal elements of the work. It's like you'd forgotten what you were doing there. Yeah, they were actually ones experiencing the work, right, as what it was. I think that the quote that Eddie read is the key one on 79, where it's the clearest, where the consciousness of art, the aesthetic consciousness, is always secondary to the immediate truth claim that proceeds from the work of art itself. And that's one of the main themes of Truth and Method, right, is the idea that truth isn't banished from the realm of art to belong only to the sciences. When we judge a work of art on the basis of aesthetic qualities, something that is really much more intimately familiar to us is alienated. And that's what hermeneutics helps us get over. Eric.
Right. So that page, right, you just keep going on 79. He starts talking about the insight that Nazis had. Because just like the practitioners coming to the Madonna in the Met and praying, you have the National Socialist politics of art acknowledging that the whole goal is to get people to participate. And that to me leads to the next the other topic I wanted to get at on page 80, where he talks about the political situation of those who produce the art, right? Or the historian, right? Or whoever is doing this has a political situation. And, I'm thinking about, we talk about alienation, tradition, history, aesthetic consciousness in kind of apoliticized terms, instead of this kind of how politics permeates all of that positionality as well, right? Everything is hermeneutics, everything is political, whatever, right? And so that he brings up National Socialism. What is his political situation in the writing of this, right? So the politics of the hegemony of the natural sciences into the humanities, right? The academic politics of that. Where misunderstanding, I was trying to think of examples of misunderstanding too, where, so this gets into page 81, where we can't hear someone speak. It's one thing to bring up works of art speaking to us. It's another thing when, look, I don't know what's okay to bring up or not, right? But I think of the Islamic resistance movements in Palestine and Lebanon, whatever, when they speak for themselves, they're saying something very different than how they're kind of caricatured on the international landscape or stage. And so it's really hard for us, given our political situation as Westerners, to be able to hear them speaking as a thou. And so there's no point that I'm making. I'm just kind of carrying forward this kind of, he brings up National Socialism as a particular instance where there's this clarity of being able to control the very kind of non-alienated form of relationship to art, and then explicitly states that it's because we are all embedded in these political situations. And so I'm trying to think of my own political situation, which inhibits my ability to hear others as a thou, uh, who might need the most kind of hearing that we can give right now. That's all.
Right. So there's the historical embeddedness of the historian, the historical embeddedness of the artist, and there's also the historical embeddedness of the person who is receiving the work of art or receiving what someone is trying to say, to express. And these both can facilitate or limit the ways in which people are reaching one another. Is that fair? I think the National Socialism paragraph I thought was an interesting transition because we don't expect art really to be, we expect art to reflect something about its creator, right? We don't expect it to be neutral in the way we would think a good history should be neutral, or even science should be neutral, right? I mean, that's part of the whole idea of science is anyone should be able to reproduce the results and be exactly the same. But a work of art should reflect the artist. So when you have the National Socialist example where it's talking about formalism, so I think the thought is formalism is an attempt by abstraction to get away from anything culturally particular in art, to speak with a kind of universality. I'm thinking like Mondrian. It's like no matter what art you create as your folk art, it is all lines and colors. So I'm just going to do lines and colors because that's going to become the most universal thing, because now it is the most independent. It is no longer reflective of me as an artist. It is just the essence of art. So I think that's the transition there, is he suggests that abstraction is almost like the scientific attempt to be culturally neutral in the way we've made our works of art. And he says the National Socialists realize there's something misleading about that art is always bound to a community. And he agrees with that. And artistic creation stands within a particular community. And that community is always distinguishable from the cultured society, and he's pointing at me here, that is informed and terrorized by art criticism. Yeah, people like me who don't know what they say about an abstract work of art until I've read art critics tell me what I should think about it. That's my life. But that's the transition to historical consciousness, right, Eric? And that's where you want us to go next. John, do you want to say something about aesthetic consciousness, aesthetic alienation? You're muted, John Beach.
Just a quick one on what Eric said is that I see that your point, Eric, but see, once you already say I and thou, you're beat, you're done. You've got alienation. Gadamer says, no, I and thou doesn't cut it. You got to get underneath that. You got to look for the deep commonality that I and thou already expresses Cartesian alienation. It always has subjectivity in it that you can never overcome. So in a sense, yeah, your experience is correct. And there is a lot to say about sharing, a historical culture and a mother tongue and so on. But nevertheless, when Gadamer says we should think about other religions, other cultures now, this is, we're in a global world, so we have to go beneath that. And but even in our own culture, he's saying, no, I and thou, no, that's not good. That's not where he is, where he's going. That's all I wanted to say. I think, what you're saying sort of fits in with that.
Yeah, good. Michael Rascon.
So I really like that example used of the religious painting versus looking at it as like a aesthetically, what we're talking about, aesthetic consciousness. What was it? What was that painting again? Could
Okay,
you
I can look it up. It's at the Met. Let me give me a second and I'll find it.
Because I think we could use that to kind of flesh out what he's trying to say.
This painting right here. I'll put the link here.
But I could use another example too. Like, I think what he's trying to get at is when you look at a piece of art like that, we're looking at the strokes or their color use or any of that, there's a natural separation from your own personal life and history that could be connected to what the art is talking about. Like, for example, if you have a religious piece that addresses the idea of sin, that's a hard thing to separate from your own experience of guilt and things like that that could be related to that thing. So aesthetically to me just means you're cutting your subjectivity from connecting to what the artwork is about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think important is that when it comes to deciding what the work of art is about, it has to connect to the way it speaks to you, right? It isn't just sort of an objective thing. You can imagine art historians saying, well, what this is about, and then they have a certain sort of historical template. And they say, well, people were painting things like this at this time, painted it this way. And that's why this is about, this is about St. Peter, and this is about, right, in the ways in which and I think Gadamer thinks that's a mistake. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah. There's a part that I think connects this because when he's mentioning this, he mentions contemporaneousness.
Oh, yeah.
And I feel like that's really connected to what he's trying to get at. On page in my book, it's on page 6, but I don't know where it is in the
What does the paragraph begin with?
To be sure, Nietzsche is
Yeah.
an ecstatic witness.
Page 80 for us.
Oh, page 80 and it's towards the end of the paragraph, but he says, let's see, the part that I thought was meaningful was when he says, while the great productive achievements of scholarship always preserve something of the splendid magic of immediately mirroring the present in the past and the past in the present. To me, that's what happens when you look at an artwork. You read a book from like the 1600s, you're mirroring your experience that you went through to something that happened 400 years ago and kind of keeping those things together and making a connection.
Mm-hmm. I think you're exactly right. I think it's artists seems like the paradigm case. The question is about history, because I think a lot of historians would call this presentism. It's like, we're not trying to understand this period in order to understand ourselves or our own times. We're just trying to understand the French Revolution or whatever it is. But I think Gadamer thinks, well, he says just what you read. The great productive achievements of scholarship are the ones that show the connection between the present and the past, and the past and the present. Right, this sort of idea of the prejudice is the inescapable prejudice. One of the main themes of it, when I've taught this, I guess one of the most important things I try to get across the idea to students is the idea that we're always shaped by our prejudices, by our biases, by our history, by our culture, our traditions. But these don't mean we are limited to only our prejudice, our biases, our culture, our tradition. In fact, it's because we have these prejudices that we can come up with general insights about the past, that we can find ways that they speak to us, that works of art can still be alive to us today. The prejudices, because then I think one natural way to think is that, well, if you're prejudiced, you're biased, and if you're biased and you don't have anything to say about it, be other than to just continue to express your biases. I think that's one of the real insights here that are worth taking away. John Beach.
Yeah, I was thinking that even the classical in the work of art would be classified as a prejudice. It stands, it's true, but it's still a prejudgment. It's still what forms us. Without prejudices, we wouldn't be able to appreciate art or history at all. This is the hard thing for us to overcome, the negativity of and Gadamer uses the word prejudice in this intentionally provocative sense to make us think about this. And so its prejudices are not something. It's just not like it's not like subjectivity or something, or some sort of personal or sort of my sort of bias. It's something that's it's without. I mean, it's embedded within the language we speak and the thoughts we have. Without prejudice, we would have no thinking, speaking, or language whatsoever, let alone written language. So I don't know if that makes sense.
So what do you think he means when on page 81, I'm looking at just going to the next page. And this is where he talks about the I and thou, and maybe that's not the best way to talk about things. At the bottom of the middle paragraph, it must be about the next page for those of you who have philosophical hermeneutics. The paragraph is, I'm trying to call attention here to a common experience. At the end, he says, our task, it seems to me, is to transcend the prejudices that underlie aesthetic consciousness, historical consciousness, and the kind of hermeneutical consciousness that has been restricted to a technique for avoiding misunderstandings, and to overcome the alienations present in them all. So there's a kind of inherited prejudice, I guess, right, that creates alienation in our aesthetic consciousness, our historical consciousness, and our hermeneutic consciousness.
But it's a double-sided. I know it's hard to grasp. I find it difficult to grasp, but we overcome. In other words, like we free ourselves. Like this is philosophizing. This is being a philosopher. This is being creative. This is sort of as we understand our prejudices, they stand out more, and we understand them. They might have seemed self-evident or unconscious, but it's the whole. I know it's a tough one, and fair enough. That's good, excellent objection, and but it's not like they're we want to get to good prejudices,
Right.
And not unconscious, not unquestioned prejudices.
Yeah.
I think that maybe that's a way out of the problem.
To put them to the test, then right? That's what I was going to say. Is it doesn't end. So if people that are upset about having prejudices and them being unauthorized authority, I think Gadamer would say is, but the way it doesn't end there, you continue to test the prejudice to see if it's either verified or not. And so I'm agreeing with you. I'm agreeing with what you're saying. Just saying the people who have, like I just repeating the same thing, who are against prejudices and the authority that comes with it. Gadamer would just say, but we have to start from there, but that doesn't mean we end there, basically. Yep. Is you continue to test them to see if they're verified and valid.
So it is possible to transcend particular prejudices, but not transcend all prejudices. Does that sound?
And Gadamer is going back to the original meaning of prejudice. Before the Enlightenment, in the French 17th century legal system, préjugé was the initial judgment that the judge rendered, and it was then it was a refining of that, and it was so this is the Aristotle says all knowledge begins with knowledge, and you can't start with nothing. You can't start out of nowhere, and you don't try to replace that knowledge, but you refine it, and you sort of you sort of sort it out, and that's what you find out not just what it means to you, but what it means in itself. And so it's but it goes right to the heart of Gadamer's thought. I know. And
Ty, you've been waiting.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with what you were just saying, and like in those next few paragraphs that from that one you pointed out, Dave. He says, what is it then in these experiences that seem to us to have been left out? And then the next few paragraphs, he just articulates that. So the very top of 82, the last sentence of that first couple of lines, rather our sensitive spiritual existence is an aesthetic resonance chamber that resonates with the voices that are constantly reaching us and preceding all explicit aesthetic judgments. So like going into those, to me, using the word transcend is sort of, maybe there's something interesting in there that I'm not getting, but it seems to be moving just in the direction you all were talking about, is that you're going into saying, yes, there are lots of prejudices, and our job isn't to like push those away. It's to go into that true sense of prejudice as prejudgment. And seeing ourselves living within those. So yeah.
Yep, thanks. And I wanted to say, Ty, just in case you have to run off and save lives and do like something like that, is that I hope people can make it to Calgary in June. Aren't you on the program for the Canadian Hermeneutic Institute this year?
I am, yes.
Yeah. What are you
Yes.
presenting? You want to plug it quickly? I'll send
Oh,
I'll put
yeah.
the link down here.
Yeah, it's a paper. It's going to be on the sublime imagination is kind of what I'm titling it as, and so like kind of the imagination and recours, and as it kind of relates to Gadamer's idea of play, even though Gadamer kind of pushes that away a little bit, but uh, so I'm working that out, and also that's connected. If you all don't know, I'm a firefighter, and how that relates to the experience of firefighting. We find ourselves in those sort of uh, difficult situations that I'm going to construe as the sublime, and sort of the imagination is a way to hermeneutically deal with that. So that's the
Yeah, great.
short version.
For those of you who have never been, it's one of sort of the great hermeneutic experiences in North America each year, the annual conference in Calgary. I put the link down there in case you want to know more about it. Okay, thanks for waiting, Eddie.
Yeah, John, let's see if this passage in the reading works to sort of get a hold on to what Gadamer has in mind. Page 80 is the Nietzsche paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
Right about two-thirds down, he says, no one disputes the fact that controlling the prejudices of our own present to such an extent that we do not misunderstand the witnesses of the past is the valid aim. But obviously, such control doesn't completely fulfill the task of understanding the past and its transmissions. Indeed, it could very well be that only insignificant things in historical scholarship permit us to approximate this ideal of totally extinguishing individuality, while the great productive achievements of scholarship always preserve something of the splendid magic of the immediately mirroring the present in the past and the past in the present. So I think the easy way out is to say, well, yes, control prejudices, control misunderstandings, that works. But if that's what we only do, we miss out. We end up missing all the fascinating experiences, all the connections we could draw, all the meanings we could unravel, and just stick on to some superficial, if not insignificant, um, events. And that's not contributive. That is not what hermeneutics has in mind for Gadamer, if that makes sense.
John, what do you think?
Yeah, I totally, and I think that when he talks about the present, he's talking about our prejudices. We harmonize. I mean, you know, and what we know, and no, it's a total, as Eddie says, like it's a total harmonization there. And I mean, I remember Gadamer once said to me, "You see how Heidegger sort of shakes hands with the Greeks?" And I thought that's a good way of putting it. But yeah, 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 that's a good point. Yeah.
Hey, Eric.
I wanted to move a little bit into like the kind of interrogation of prejudices on page 84. At the very top, he's talking about statistics being suitable for propaganda purposes.
And this is paragraph. Let me just say, for those who are reading the other book, the paragraph
Yeah.
begins, the problem is really universal. The hermeneutical
Yeah.
question is not restricted. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and getting into the next paragraph, but I am anticipating the phenomenon or phenomenon. Yeah. So this kind of construction of the language of facts, where facts are not mind independent events, but sentences. So facts are a mode of discourse, right? Facts answer questions. Facts are not found things. If I'm right. And so everything, right? So the next paragraph, I'm anticipating and inadvertently use the phrase, the question that fits the facts, right? Are we engineering questions to fit the facts that we're quote unquote finding, right? We find these facts and then come up with the question that they were supposed to be answering. Or are we starting with questions that we are actually asking, and then the assertions, the answer address those questions, like why those questions rather than others, right? Like this is interrogating our contemporary situation, and that's where it gets into this methodological sterility that's not rooted in genuine questions.
Right.
The thing that I want to get at though is this kind of linguistic focus that feels like people are very resistant to. It's not the linguistic turn of philosophy in the last century, but it's related to that, because I think people want to see facts as non-sentential entities rather than grasping that and so he does this with aesthetics too on page 82 with, where is this at? Yeah, 82. So it's the paragraph right before. The situation is similar to the historical consciousness. He's still talking about aesthetics. And it seems that what he's saying, at least in a Ricoeurian interpretation here, is that can we do a semantics of the aesthetic rather than a formalism of the aesthetic? Because it's about what artworks are saying, and saying involves sentences, assertions that are answers to questions. And so one of the prejudices that I think we resist interrogating is this kind of the linguistic ontology that we went to when we read that section of Truth and Method together, like a few times ago, right? Like, what is this? The horizon. What is the phrase that he uses in Truth and Method for the title of that third section? The horizon of a linguistic ontology or something like that? Language as horizon of a hermeneutic ontology.
There we go.
That last section of Truth and Method, that there's this kind of resistance to this direct address of just specific sentences. I don't think that's.
Yeah, I feel like there are small issues and there's a big metaphysical issue. So the statistics one, when I read that, I thought about this on top of 84. I get now and then a fake political survey where someone calls and says, we're doing a political survey. We want to ask your questions because we want to get a sense of where Michiganders stand about this. And then they say, well, how do you feel about the governor destroying the traditional values that have made Michigan great? And everyone's, well, wait a minute, this is not what I thought it was, right? But it's because they can get data by asking questions that way, but by doing so, effective propaganda must always try to initially influence the judgment of the person addressed and restrict the possibilities of judgment. So it seems to be now just a matter of fact, but in fact, everything is being loaded into the way it's being worded, the options that are before me. So it's clearly a fake kind of objectivity and neutrality. But then there is this question about fitting the facts, right? Is there anything to really talk about when we talk about fitting the facts? And when we talk about language, we're talking about improving prejudices. When we improve our prejudices, are we improving them on the basis of getting us closer to the facts, getting us closer to the way things actually are? And if not, by what criteria are we?
It's getting us to the assertions that actually speak truth to us.
Yeah, but usually when we use the word truth, we mean it actually like captures something about the world. And I think that's not what you mean by that, Eric, when you say that, right? When it speaks truth, now we're getting closer to reality. Um, just this sort of question happens at the very end, so maybe we should hold off until we get there. When he starts to talk about who's the person, Johannes Lohmann's philosophy of language, and says explicit things about how understanding is language bound, and we live within languages. But maybe we can hold off from that. John Beach.
Yeah, just a small point on the word facts. Gadamer has no problem with the word fact.
Yeah.
And in fact, he speaks about the factuality of the Greek understanding of speech and so on. But we get into trouble when we equate fact with object. You know, that's problematic. And so Gadamer doesn't use that term, object, really. Well, sort of just in a very casual sense, but it's I mean, object brings a whole group of ontological presuppositions along with it. It brings in the presupposition of the ontological primacy of the subject. It brings in Descartes, and this was Heidegger's whole goal was to overcome and overturn Descartes, and he was never sure if he'd done that. And Gadamer, basically goes along with that. But I think we shouldn't be too frightened of the use of the word fact. I mean, statistics is a great way of manipulating. There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. It has a beautiful way of manipulating facts with statistics. But the hermeneutic should be able to cut through that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a good point about facts versus objects, how we collapse those. So let me just make sure that we've Joseph, we've crossed off alienation. You feel like we've covered that? You feel satisfied with that?
I feel. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I put on my headphones, but I feel pretty good with that. Yeah.
Okay, pretty good with that. Okay.
Chewing on it for a while, but yeah.
And we focused on aesthetic alienation, and we've been talking more recently about historical alienation. But Willow, would you like to get in here?
Yeah, just quickly before we move on from the topic of alienation, and this is just kind of peripherally related to the conversation that we've been having, but I think it's interesting that when Gadamer is discussing alienation in this text, and probably also in Truth and Method, alienation often appears alongside the term task, that it is our task to overcome alienation. And personally, at least, I find that interesting for a couple of reasons, if only because philosophical hermeneutics is often described as like an exclusively descriptive project, that at no point does Gadamer prescribe any responsibilities to us. And it seems quite clear by how often this term is showing up in this kind of centerpiece of philosophical hermeneutics, that he is indeed prescribing some kind of responsibility to us. And here, at least, that seems to be overcoming our alienation. And I guess I'm wondering, and I don't know if this question is interesting to others, but in overcoming our alienation, is it only the case that we begin to learn or understand ourselves better, or is there like some other possible outcome that might come from overcoming alienation? Is it also the case potentially that we learn to understand artwork better, or learn to understand history better, or just generally learn to understand the world better? And then just one other comment on the topic of, assigning responsibility to overcome alienation is that I really don't think he's limiting this responsibility to hermeneutes. I think that when he is claiming that this is our responsibility, he really means this is our collective responsibility. That if one indeed wants to understand themselves better or understand the world better and so on and so forth, then their first and foremost responsibility is to overcome this ontological, epistemological alienation.
No, I think that's great. Does someone want to speak to that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Go right
Well,
ahead.
I would just say that Heidegger wrote a book, what is called thinking, and his point was, what does thinking call us? What does philosophy call us to think about? And Gadamer is constantly saying it. It talks. It's calling us. The survival of life on the planet is one thing that it calls for us. And that's why there's no assertion is possible that cannot be understood as an answer to a question. And Aristotle says all philosophy begins in aporia, it begins in a question, begins in a problem, and for Plato too. And there's a dialectic and language, and they never. And just to throw in a quick side, aesthetics, modern aesthetics is based on experience. The Greeks, it wasn't based on experience, nor was it based on feeling. But anyway, that's the subjectivization of aesthetics that you get in with Kant. Like Kant articulates that. But yeah, no, definitely philosophy is places a very good point. It does, and I mean, its phenomenology is descriptive, but not hermeneutics. Phenomenology basically is limited to the descriptive. Yeah,
Yep.
that's my
I
response.
think, yeah, definitely the case. I also think that although a lot of the normative elements of Gadamer tend to seem sort of epistemological, like even the encounter with the others is to allow us to transcend our prejudices, right? To create a sort of new understanding, which sounds like it's just simply about understanding better or wider. Or I think that for Gadamer, there are moral expectations as well in ideas of openness and solidarity and friendship that aren't just about expanding and improving our minds, that are about
Oh, for sure.
improving our lives and our social lives. I
Hmm.
think so. Will, I think you're really picking up on the normative thrust of Gadamer that even goes beyond sort of the epistemic questions to moral questions of community. Eric, do you want to get in here?
yeah. No, Willow, I really appreciate what you brought up, and it created connections for me. And I placed it in the chat that there's this history of Christian theologians that are kind of in this circle of conversants like Bultmann, Tillich, Heidegger, Gadamer, and they're like Tillich talks about sin, right? The existential interpretation of sin is that it's estrangement or alienation, and so salvation is the ability to overcome that alienation. And to me, it goes beyond the moral, David, what you were just highlighting, to the political, right? To get to our political situation where I look at Hegseth and Trump and these Netanyahu, that they're nihilists. The alienation is embodied in a nihilistic treatment of our world that's shared together. That's why, right, capitalists and corporations end up polluting our environment, making it unsustainable for life, because there's kind of an indifference to the continuing of being or life. So like Nietzsche and Marx getting at exposing the nihilism that comes from the alienated disposition that start to engineer the profitability of exploiting us, right? So by not being alienated, one would hope that they would be less exploitable, something like that. That's what it makes me think of, Willow, what you brought up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. Max? No, we dropped out.
It muted.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
There we go.
So I was thinking like kind of trying to get to like what are some ways to like think about the alienation. I think in this sense it was like we end up with the inability to like articulate the questions that are kind of coming from the things we encounter. Like, because I mean, Gadamer talks about like the contemporary, yeah, I'm not, you know what I'm saying, trying to say, of like of art, and that it like the questions still speak to us. But I think like I'm wondering if part of the alienation is not just in art, but in other things, is that like we can't like those things are asking the questions. The like life is asking these questions, and like but we can't articulate them. We don't know why they're there. And if you get too far from those questions, I like bringing up like the nihilism that comes from when you almost like embrace that in like the lack of those questions, you just embrace it as, well, I guess this is just life. You end up being detached from yourself, from others, from the thing you're dealing with, from the world. And it seems like I don't know. I'm wondering, like Gadamer, talks about phronesis in terms of understanding, but it seems like you can't really separate phronesis from also just like action, like doing things, and like I'm wondering if there's something about if you've lost the questions, then you are going to have a really, really hard time finding the right way forward when there's, moral questions involved. Like you need to, not like, academically necessarily, like if you're not an academic, you'll never have the questions, but just like if you can't receive the question of the thing that's there, then your question about what's the good of the business will all be about profit rather than the good of the community. And like so many like MBA people, like people in MBA programs, like that seems to be what they're getting about this is what a business is. But it's like they're alienated from the very kind of questions that are screaming at them. It's like, hey, what about paying your workers enough? And yeah, so that seems to be like I don't know, a moral implication of alienation, like you were talking about. So anyway, that's enough of me like rambling, but I love the question. Thank you. That was
No, thanks, Max. Ty, and then I'm going to go to page 85, which really sort of builds on what Max was just saying.
Just really quickly, this reminded me of I was just reading an essay by Katie Stelfox, who just published in the Journal of Applied Hermeneutics, and it was her dissertation. And one of the things she's a nurse that has her PhD in nursing, and she was writing about nursing aides' experiences during COVID. And one of the problems that they would run into is feeling like they were acting in sort of a transactional kind of way, rather than like a way that involved caring and friendship and solidarity. And I think it speaks exactly to this, where they've lost sort of a sense, like the corporate pull in those nursing facilities that she was talking about was to, just do her job and not to care about like the sort of familial connections with the patients. And like, so I think that's right on with that, Max.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great example. On 85, this is what I was thinking of when Max was talking. Gadamer's talked now about, at this point, he's talked about science. He's talked about a very scientific approach to history. And he ends the paragraph. The paragraph begins in answering this objection. He's talking about the extremity of certain large industrial research facilities in America and Russia. And it ends by saying, it is the imagination that's the
David, there's something wrong with your microphone.
Okay.
I think your book might have covered it for a second.
Okay. You're right.
You're good,
right.
you're good now.
Yeah, I think I put this right in front of it. He says, the imagination, it is the imagination that is, it is the decisive function for the scholar. Imagination naturally has a hermeneutical function and serves the sense for what is questionable. It serves the ability to expose real productive questions, something in which, generally speaking, only he who masters all the methods of his science succeeds. I don't know about that last part. I don't know if I need to master all the science in order to be able to ask the bigger questions about science. But then he talks, his examples with Plato and Socrates, and about how at some point in dialogue, Socrates turns to the interlocutor to provide the questions, and they don't know what to ask. They don't, nothing occurs to them that's worth going into. So it's this sort of situation where you're not able to think of questions, where you're not able to explore and be challenged by your own imagination. And then he says the real power of hermeneutical consciousness is our ability to see what is questionable. I mean, this reading has tons of little money quotes from Gadamer. You can just we can pull them out as sort of a greatest hits list, but that's one of them, right? The real power of hermeneutical consciousness is our ability to see what is questionable. And you can see how that would be something very different than what a scientific methodology or historical methodology would provide for you. Michael.
Yeah, I don't know how other people felt, but this part, I couldn't help but think about what's going on today with AI and like the data centers. And this whole paragraph just screamed to me of that, of like the difference between genuine questions and having data centers running things that are just not connected to reality and questionable, and kind of that rabbit hole of like the negative that could come with that.
Yeah, I think Eddie, you mentioned in framing earlier, right?
Yes, Gestell. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the first things technology does is convinces you it's necessary and inescapable, and that's
Yeah.
part of the way it sort of frames everything. So it doesn't make any sense to think without it. Why would you think there's a problem with AI? It's just a tool, and it's the most powerful tool there is, and so there's nothing to ask here, right? That's sort of one of the ways that the in framing Gestalt works.
There's always just this. Yeah.
Oh yeah, Eddie, go ahead.
Yeah. There's always just this in a Heideggerian sense, right? There's always only one thing, one thing, that one entity or one concept that grounds everything within. So it says, well, yeah, there's no way to escape from it. It's everything's already been grounded within. So be it. That's the kind of tragedy sort of we're facing in today's time.
Yeah. So Ty, I thought the same, or Michael, I thought the same sort of thing. All right, this inability to ask real questions. Yes, Eric.
Michael, to run with that a little bit more with the AI thing, I was just seeing that, I teach online for a couple different colleges, and it's 90% AI at this point. And the institutions themselves are not even helping. But I did notice that I'm seeing commercials for ChatGPT where people are like asking ChatGPT to give them an exercise routine, or asking ChatGPT what they should say to somebody to get a second date. Like, this is what's on. And so it's weird because in a way that is, right, search engines are a mode of perceiving the questionability of life, because every time we are using search engines, we are kind of engaged in the process of questioning, but it's usually closed questions, right? Like, yes, no, give me the exact one answer that's going to solve this. So it's more like problem solution. Doesn't Gadamer call
application too?
Yeah,
The lack of application.
And so this kind of call for genuine questions relates to me with why AI is able to infiltrate so far, because we are alienated from language. And so the language that is produced by AI looks a lot like really good language to people who don't speak and listen and ask questions. Because I have students that will then say to me, who are clearly not using AI, they'll say, I feel like I need to drop your class because I see other students writing and they know what's going on really well. And I'm telling the student who's not using AI, no, you're actually the one who's learning and sounding awesome. Whereas these folks, like, you just are not educated enough to understand that what they're saying is vacuous.
Yeah.
It looks beautiful, right? And so part of the alienation of language that I'm kind of really interested in right now is the decoupling or debundling of syntactic quality and semantic content, because the syntactic quality of AI is really great, but the semantic content is vacuous. So how do you teach people to be able to ask the questions to which these sentences are the answer? Because AI says a lot, but nothing of substance, because there's no question that it's actually answering beyond, you know, whatever the prompt was. I can't even think of an example now. Anyway, sorry for the soapbox.
That's why I see it at Gadamer as so relevant, even more so today, just because if you can understand the point that language is a life process, and then cognitively offloading it to a computer is you're missing out on all that. And that's kind of it's a scary thing that I think that with the help of Gadamer, we can kind of maybe help communicate to people.
So, Eric, you've often mentioned the quote on page 88. It's the last paragraph of the reading where he says, when we hear modern lovers talking to each other, we often wonder if they are communicating with words or with advertising labels and technical terms from sign language of the modern industrial world. And you can imagine two people flirting over texts, and both of their texts are being written by AI back and forth, right? As they sort of default to that rather than use their own voice because they want to be sort of as
not to betray
possible.
too much, but I've literally had that happen.
Been in an AI flirt with somebody else. Okay. So all right, so that would be a modern version of what he's talking about, right? Where people are incapable of being sincere with their words because in his examples it's advertising. Maybe it's, the person who gives a Hallmark card where everything's all written out perfectly and just signs the bottom.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
But the contrast I'm seeing on that page, right? It's the last couple paragraphs, stammering, right? That he kind of, and I've seen Irigare talk about this too, that there's something about the stammering that is indicative of the desire to speak genuinely. That, see you later, that is not available in this kind of method of language, right? The production of pretty language versus the stammering of genuine language, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we have a half hour left. Let's turn to this section where he talks about especially focus on language. Because I think what happens is he talks about different forms of alienation, different forms of consciousness. And then he talks about the ways in which science or history tries to escape our prejudices and our embeddedness and how that is not going to work. And then the paradigm example of our embeddedness is going to be language, right? Our use of language, I think, is how the paper unfolds. I'm thinking he begins on
like 85, because I'm looking
86.
at where the definite articulation of the world is built up. Like the last paragraph on, well, no, it's starting on page 86, the very top. The sensitive student
right,
of language.
Exactly. I was thinking maybe even the bottom of 87. Is that right, or should we start earlier?
That works.
Okay. The discussion shows is where I'm thinking. The discussion shows how the claimed universality that is appropriate to the hermeneutical dimension is to be understood. Understanding is language bound, is one of those key phrases. This does not lead us into linguistic relativism. That's an important combination. It's true we live within a language. I'm not a fan of the spatial metaphor there, but maybe it could be in, like being in the world is not a spatial metaphor. Um, True, it is true we live within, but language is not a system of signals that we send off with the aid of a telegraphic key when we enter the office or transmission station. That is not speaking, for it does not have the infinity of the act that is linguistically creative and world experiencing. Okay, Eric likes those. Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
From this point on until the end of the article, that is when he starts to mention the idea of the infinity.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if that's like when you're having a genuine conversation, you keep the infinity open of possibility and genuine conversation, and maybe that could be the difference between if we're running with that same example of AI,
Mm.
it cuts it off as soon as you get your results for whatever you're searching or trying to figure out. But as a human, keeping discussion open, that infinity is constantly open.
I don't even think it's a matter of keeping discussion open. I think it's a feature of language that he thinks anything can be said. I don't think that Gadamer thinks there's anything. It's almost like there's nothing ineffable for Gadamer. There's no limits to language except the contingent limits that we actually have at any moment. That's what I think he's saying is. But
Every answer raises new questions too.
yes,
Like Aristotle wrote the physics, and then he had to write the metaphysics to deal with all the questions that were raised by the physics. And it's interesting that Gadamer ends with Aristotle. I mean, because it's to be expected, I guess. And so they like Aristotle science didn't have anything to do with experience. It had to do with how we speak about things. So he went to the large language model, and they pared it down. This dialectic is as well ends up that way too. And in that sense, that there is a teleology in language itself that we don't control.
mm-hmm. Yeah. So, what do you make of that claim? That was he says that, right? The teleology within language, that's on the page before. There's a teleology that operates constantly in the language of life.
Yeah, well, he says that all the time, or I mean, not all the time, but like constantly refers to that throughout his work, and that's where thoughts and ideas and abstractions, the universals arise, and that's where Aristotle's principles come from, and it's something that you can't go behind or manipulate or beyond. Said he would say is beyond our control. And that's the Greek world. As opposed to the modern world where language is a tool. It's an instrument of communication,
Mm-hmm.
and it's something that's used by subject, a subject, which did not exist in the Greek world. There is no,
Okay. Right.
It's being. It's not It's not the subject. It's ontologically primary.
Yeah.
And he's also in Heidegger,
Yeah.
that much. Gadamer doesn't agree with a lot that just like Aristotle didn't agree with everything that Plato says, but there's a lot of Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that. Joseph.
David, this goes along with what you were talking about just a moment ago when you were talking about infinity, and you said for Gadamer there is no ineffable, right?
That's my thought.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, but I also see an interesting tension with Gadamer, where on the one hand, nothing is ineffable. On the other hand, we always have, as he says, an undistilled desire for the right word. Or at the end of this page, this paper, he says, like, we're always looking for the word that reaches the other.
Yes.
So I don't know. There's this. I feel like I experienced that a lot. There's always a kind of like we're infinitely trying to build up our world. We're infinitely looking for the right word to reach those with whom we're in relationships with. On the one hand, things are ineffable. On the other hand, as Rilke says, not everything's so sayable. We're always looking for new ways to say things. That's kind of how I read the infinity part, or at least a part of it. But
Yeah. So part of the infinity is the recognition that there's always more to say. That there isn't, that we haven't reached a final end. And there's this also, yeah. Okay. This seems
Human
pretty
finitude.
right. Right. Good. So it's linguistically creative and world experiencing. Language is world experiencing. There's no captivity. So one reason there's no linguistic relativity is to talk about something being linguistically relative. It means that each sort of language has its own point of view on the world, a conceptual scheme, a way of sort of organizing things, and in some sense they're incommensurable, right? And what you say is relative only to your language. But if things can constantly be translated, if you can always learn new languages, if words can change, can move from language to language, if ways of talking can always improve, new ways of expressing can come up, they can use words from other languages like telos, then it seems like there isn't any reason to say that there are different conceptual schemes at any time or different ways of seeing the world, so much as just simply saying there are different ways of talking about the world.
And Aristotle comes up with all kinds of new words that were never spoken in Greek before. This is what philosophy does. You transform the language. And when you search for that word, and I would love to just I'd love to describe this experience I had with Gadamer that refers to relativity. It's a quick little anecdote.
Okay, go for it.
Can I do that? Okay.
Yeah.
He was, when I was doing my PhD with him, it was McMaster and Guelph. It was a joint PhD program, and we all went up to Guelph, and all the profs and the graduate students there were all ready to interrogate him. And so at the end, the Q&A, someone said, well, your thought is, you're a relativist. And they'd already decided that long before they'd ever read, and Gadamer, patiently tried to explain, why hermeneutics is not a relativism. And of course, and as soon as he'd say something, some say, yeah, that's relativism. And then, they kind of ganged up, and he kind of put everything he sort of stopped everybody in their tracks. And by just saying one thing, and I don't think they really understood the philosophical import of it, but at some level they grasped it and they realized that something called. He said, does anyone here have a prophet? Like, are any of you Donald Trump or something, or whatever? And they just, whoa, that was it. But he was a little heated at that point. He just said, this, anyway. So that's the little story, because relativism has no meaning if there's no absolute truth, really.
Yeah, what does it mean to say this is relative to something else if there isn't something objective and fixed to be relative to?
Yeah, epistemology assumes that the truth comes from science, and so they were assuming that, Anyway.
Yeah, no, that's great. I like it.
Okay. Thank you.
Ty.
I guess I kind of have a question. So I get frustrated with Gadamer's primacy of language, because to me it seems like unless he's kind of equivocating on what language is, meaning that it like incorporates things like gestures and things like that we sort of retranslate back into linguistic or types of language. And if that's what he's doing, that seems okay. But he seems to be doing more than that. But I'm wondering if the tension that I see is that that hermeneutics and understanding is not just something that is unembodied and that takes place outside of our activity. And if that's the case, then how is that language? And or even does that mean that language is primary? And am I missing something? Is there some kind of that's just something that sort of bothers me in Gadamer, that I see, that I kind of, when I read it, I sort of like go, yeah, but what about the things we're doing, the solidarities that aren't just words, or even using the slogans about, sending to your loved one, but also there are actions that you do for your loved one. You show up to dinner, or you take their hand, or something like an embrace or something like that, or even just two friends or enemies embracing or something.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that question, it's sort of
But
it's not a wealth. Yeah.
when my partner says, words cannot express how much I love you, I respond with, well, then you need to learn more language. You need to learn more words, because that's not language's fault. No, I'm with you. I was just making a joke. That's related to this embodiment of the love that accompanies the discourse. And so why is it that we isolate just the discourse as the place of alienation, rather than the entire embodied relationality is where the alienation is happening?
Right. And sorry, a conflict isn't just words or rhetoric. It's often like actual, actions of aggression or misdeeds or something. I don't know. Yeah. Sorry, I cut someone off.
Oh, I was going to say, I think it's the first thing you said about that it comes back to language. I think because he talks a lot about gestures, but if you think about it, like if someone does performs a gesture, you never know what the meaning behind it without bringing it back to language. Like, and a gesture never exists in and of itself. You have to recognize it and then kind of allow the language behind it to express itself. You know what I mean? So I think it's the first thing you said about the primacy is just that it always goes back to language, not that it's the only thing. There's also like gestures, like you mentioned, too, and other things on top of that as well.
I think something like that is probably what he has in mind. But I mean, I guess my take on this, and I don't think it's widely shared, is that his paradigms when he was talking about this is almost always talking with people about the Greeks. It's a very heady intellectual activity for Gadamer. And he just doesn't pay a whole lot of attention to all the embodied interpersonal communication that occurs all the time. And maybe the best he could say is sort of what Michael just said is, yeah, but to really understand, you need to be able to put it in words. And words are the only ways in which you can really say you've understood something, when you understand it in words. But I don't find that very satisfactory. I guess.
Well, this is why it's the only way. Very good question, because it does not fit with modern ontology, with the way we see our self-understanding. It's totally, and in order to see a world in which that was lived and experienced and expresses the whole, you have to know get some exposure to the Greek world. See, this works. This can be real. Not what they teach about the Greeks in universities. That doesn't get it at all. That's all filtered through modern epistemology. Totally. I mean, it's getting better and better, and the erudition is so on. Like it's moving towards, but Gadamer is still way out front there. But the if you look at Aristotle's physics, for example, he gives he bases a physics on how we speak about things, and he never has to revert to experience, because we all know experiences, we all experience the same thing. But until Descartes comes along, says no, maybe it's all interpreted like there's this break, there's this subject, this ontological primacy of the subject, and that's the way. And that's why you need to read Heidegger too, like the fundamentum inconcussum. Descartes never said those words ever. Heidegger says the fundamentum absolutum and inconcussum. That means it's a new beginning. That's a new beginning for the way we understand ourselves. Totally new. And Gadamer is trying to break through that. That's why he says, 50% is Greek, 50% is hermeneutics, and they're like two foci and an ellipse. They're totally related, and so on. And I mean, that's why But I mean, it's a great question that illustrates that difficulty that someday will hopefully will break through while we still have time.
So, yes, Max.
Yeah, I think I can't offhand remember, but like I know there are some like comments from Gadamer because it seems like you have truth and method, and it very much like leans towards like we're talking about language as language, but then like he has later things talking about gesture and like linguisticality, Sprachlichkeit, all like, and it seems like the idea of language gets broadened, and I think there's like some comment he makes somewhere where it almost seems like it's more that like I think sometimes people think about language and then they think about like all the other stuff. And it seems like when we're talking about what we're understanding and what we're like engaging with in some way, like it seems like language is his model for it. Like if like it almost seems like I'm gonna have to find the quote because I may be like going beyond here, but it's almost like even when we're like when you're like studying the natural world, like I'm looking at out a window at some trees, like there's something about my engagement with the tree that it's speaking to me, and there's a question and answer, and even though like yes, for on my part there is actual words I might be saying about leaf, flower, branch, growth. But there, even when I'm not at the point of like the articulate words yet, there's something of the, you know, pre-linguistic that's reaching towards it. There's something about even just the experience of it that has like something linguistic in it, like the language as a model, conversation, dialogue, because that's what language is the model of my experience with it, even if I haven't given it words yet. And I think that that's maybe more of what it means for like to have language at the core of things than he's trying to kind of reduce it down to words.
I like that, Max. I think, and there's actions that you can do that are sort of like stammering. Like just thinking in terms of love. Like I can try to express love or solidarity with someone, and it might be like a stammering. Like I tried to stand in solidarity with certain people, in a political moment or something, and it failed because I didn't do the right thing. I didn't stand or do the right action, and
Or 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 something I was just going to say on that, or sometimes the opposite, that it like in terms of what you're doing, you kind of failed miserably, but sometimes you also succeed. Like you
yeah,
try to
yeah,
express that like sympathy to somebody, you're like, I like you stumbled, it was the most awkward thing, and they actually felt they understood
right.
what you were.
Right. And so that yeah, I think, and thinking of it as a model is helpful to me in a certain way, but that may not be exactly what Gadamer's getting at, but I don't know.
I guess I'd say that I find Merleau-Ponty better on this count than Gadamer, and this sort of intercorporeal relation of the world that is transformed through the acquisition of language that then sort of inspires us to seek words in order to explain things and reveal things in certain ways, but things that we're already related to as embodied.
However,
Okay.
Merleau-Ponty in Visible and Invisible says that our primary embodied engagement with the world is in the interrogative mood.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So there is
And
this
I,
kind of
yeah.
mutually informative embodiment linguistic component for him too.
Yeah, and then the model of question and answer becomes a more universal form of experience and engagement with the world, not just something we do to try to understand text well. Yeah, I agree with that. That takes us far afield from what we're talking about now. Eddie, bring us back.
Where are we heading to?
We're heading to the final end. We're on page 88. We got this last paragraph. He ends by talking
Yeah,
about theology.
yeah.
So,
So if we want to go that route, then to realize that he says, well, we when we hear modern lovers talking to each other, we often wonder if they are communicating with words or with advertising labels and technical terms from the
right.
sign language of the modern industrial world. It is inevitable that the level of life forms of the industrial age also affect language. And in fact, the impoverishment of the vocabulary of language is making enormous progress. Wonderful oxymoron, right? The phenomenon we're seeing here is simply that people don't even understand the words they speak out of their mouth.
Yeah.
Which entails that we don't reflect. We're too lazy to even think about what are we referring to by speaking words. We sort of just lazily let whatever's out there to just impose some kind of meaning on us and not realize, oh, there's history, there's a movement of tradition, there's a movement of culture, there's dialogue that's going on there. And I think that is one of the key problems.
Mhm.
So the lack of identification on these underlying mechanisms in the usage of language is, I think, what's really bogging Gadamer here.
Yeah. And do you agree that that parallels? He says that this parallels the alienations he talked about earlier, about how technology is changing the way we relate to art and history
Mm,
and to text in the past,
mm,
and here also to language.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just to by the way, David, if I may slightly disagree with you,
Sure,
just
Eddie.
slightly, I think the problem of experience do hinge on um it is exposed to the danger of being trivial. It's exposed to the danger of triviality. So even if we just say, oh, I've been struck in awe, there's this wonderful experience that cannot be expressed as in words. The next follow-up question will be, yeah, then so what?
Right.
Try to tell
Yeah.
me something. And
Right.
then if that tell me something doesn't work, then all I can do is say, okay, good experience, let's move on.
Right.
Nothing could be generated um or discovered from that. Then it becomes a lonesome picture that's floating above the sea of non-meanings.
Right. It
It
Yeah.
sort of
doesn't come to a
has
stand.
So
lost
so
its
so
ability to
we,
connect to other things now.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we may always want to look for something better, more engaging, more
Hmm.
of more telling. Yeah.
Sure. Yep. I get that. How about the end? We have the fundamental dimension of hermeneutics, which is going to be about the way that language comes alive in dialogue, right? And in the process between speaker and his partner. And the ends with genuine speaking, which has something to say and hence does not give prearranged signals, but rather seeks words through which one reaches the other person, is the universal human task. So there's universal coming back at the end. And then we're just gonna the he says throws in, but especially for the theologian, whom is entrusted the saying further of a message that stands written.
What is the German word being translated as theologian? Because wouldn't preacher or right, the minister is the one who's entrusted to saying it further. The theologian is not necessarily proclaiming the good news.
It's theologian, literally. Fürden
So
theologian.
like we're talking about the active theologian in the preaching context, not the theologian in the research library. Like which saying further are we talking about? The proclaiming of the good news in the mission, you know, right? The
Yeah.
saving of others with my charisma.
Yes, I think he's talking about preachers. He's talking about preaching, right? He's talking about the ways in which the text is brought to life again and is made
And is
distinct in the
that what the
community.
fitting word is versus the magic word, right? To be able to deliver to someone good news, right? Robert Charlemagne has a book called The Being of God or something like this, where he talks about the donative power of language.
Hmm.
When when a friend of mine is discouraged and I could say, hey, take courage, and they actually become encouraged by that moment. That is the charismatic power of discourse, to donate power from one person to another. That it's the delivery of good news. It doesn't have to be like Jesus died for your sins, you're forgiven. But when I sometimes visit churches and like the pastor says, by the way, the declaration of pardon, kaboom, you're forgiven. I'm like, oh, thank God, because I was worried about that.
Yeah.
It works, right? Like,
Yeah.
does the word work? And so that's what I think the fitting word is, the words that work, not the words that are like AI technically correct.
Yeah. Yeah. They perform the function.
I had a question about a word
Yes.
used here too. Does anyone know that German word that is being translated as the saying further? Is there any other connotations to that?
Weitersagen?
Yeah, is there the saying further? What does that mean exactly? Like, I found that really interesting word to use there, but I don't know anything about German. So.
So I'm looking up to see if there's idioms.
Like,
Mum's the word is nicht weitersagen, which means, just don't say anything else. It means like to, not
Yeah,
say
say
more.
further.
Don't say it again. Don't say more.
The saying further, it means that?
Don't go on to say nicht weitersagen is mum's the word. Don't keep talking. Don't go on to say. So in this
Yes.
case, you're trying to get the word to say something. As saying further, I think is probably isn't good as anything.
To speak through the theologian. I mean, it makes sense, but it was just an interesting
To speak again.
to speak again.
Speak
Yeah,
again. Something like this. Maybe to say more.
Because doesn't he have also another essay where he talks about, I think it's in the relevance of the beautiful, where he's talking about how the modern, or the issue for the modern artist is that they have to take on the task of what the theologian had to do, and to doing exactly what he's expressing here about creating a message and then allowing it to speak through you. That's what this part reminded me of.
Okay. Yeah.
But
I would think that maybe so. Yeah, Joseph? Yeah, good.
I know we're kind of out of time, so we don't
Yeah.
you don't even have to answer this question. But like the title of the paper is the universality of the hermeneutical problem.
Right.
Can we say concisely what the problem is? Is it alienation, or is it like what is it?
I would say concisely. Here's what I'd say the problem is. The problem is we are now living in a time that encourages us to take a technological, scientific stance toward language, our experience, art, history, and in doing so alienates us from the experiences that make those things meaningful. Something like that. That's what I would say.
That's good.
That's
a
the
good answer.
problem. That's the universal problem, hermeneutical problem, is the problem of alienation. That's a historical problem.
A fitting
Universal is-
answer to my question.
Okay, is that fair? Other people would say something different if someone has
And-
something different to say.
missing out on the truth claim that comes with it.
Oh yeah,
Everything you said, and then yeah.
right.
Yeah, understanding our relationship between aesthetics, history, and hermeneutics. The three fundamental orders. Actually knowing how we genuinely interact with them.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, well, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I think this is a really good discussion of a classic text by Gadamer. We'll meet again in July, and we'll be doing something more obscure, more technical, maybe something unpublished. If you have thoughts of things you want to do, let me know, and I'll sort of dig around too and see what we can find that might be of sort of cool scholarly interest. But take care.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, David.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.